Good morning. Welcome to AEI. I'm John Fortier of AEI, and we are here for a panel today to look at the 2024 election and how it was run, but especially also to follow on to yesterday's release of a very important survey of the Election Assistance Commission, the EAVS survey, which has now been going for about 20 years, a survey which they ask election officials, secretaries of state and local election officials to assemble all sorts of data to explain really how our elections were run. So we have with us today a great panel to discuss this, both two commissioners from the Election Assistance Commission, which puts that survey out, and a world's leading expert on election administration, Charles Stewart of MIT. I guess I'll give a little bit longer introduction to both of them, but Don Palmer at the end is the current chairman of the Election Assistance Commission. Previously, he had been the election director, run elections in both Florida and Virginia. He's also the co-host of a great podcast with myself, the Voting Booth. So if you're looking for more information about election administration, we are happy to have you listen in. And I think, secret person on the, both of our panelists, other panelists have been guests and will be in the future. Tom Hicks is the deputy chairman, vice chairman, and has been chair of the Election Assistance Commission previously as a commissioner, and also had a long tenure on Capitol Hill, in particular on the House Administration Committee, which does look at how we run elections at the federal level. And then Charles Stewart, again, I mentioned, a professor at MIT who has been one of our leading experts on the study of elections, conducts surveys of his own, some of which he will talk about in addition to the election survey, and just all around, since 2000, I would say, watcher of election administration in all sorts of important ways. So I think we're going to start with the commissioners who are going to, I'm going to give you the clicker here, and I'm not sure which commissioner is starting first.
I think I'll start first.
All right, we're going to let Don Palmer begin, and just once we have our initial presentations, we have a little discussion, we will then have time for you to ask questions as well.
Well, thank you, John, for the introduction, and I want to thank the men and women at the EAC for working with election officials to really gather this information post-2024 on federal elections over the last 2 years. So the survey was released yesterday. We sent it to the House and Senate leadership. And it's one of those things that we do every 2 years pursuant to law. And so, what we did is we tried to tell the story of the 2024 election and the different policies and the different technologies that are being used in elections across America. This is one of the top slides that we have, which is some of the top line numbers. One of the things I'll just note is that there were 103 million registrations, just in that 2024 cycle. Those included updates. And I think what this shows is that a lot of Americans are moving. There's also a lot of, as list maintenance, that's how we keep the rolls clean, sort of mailers to individuals. And you can see 40 million confirmation notices sent. So one of the takeaways I got here was it was simply Americans are moving, but they are registering and voting. So one of the big takeaways that I took was the voter turnout and the voter choices, the choices that Americans are making on how they vote. Now, 158 million ballots were processed. Now, that's about 65% of the citizen voting age population, obviously a little bit higher with those that are actually registered to vote. Slightly down from 2020, but still significantly and fairly high when you look at the decades in this last century. So in-person voting continued to be popular, particularly early voting. What you had really is 70% of the population who voted cast their ballots in person, with a significant 30% voting by mail or absentee. That was slightly down. That was down from 2020, obviously with COVID. And what I take away from that is that when Americans are provided options or choices, they split it three ways. You will basically, what you're really seeing is a lot of folks deciding to use in-person on election day, Early voting is continuing to increase in popularity, and then of course, 30% voted by mail. The last thing, one of the things I'll say on this is that American election jurisdictions are making significant progress toward paper ballots. Basically, 98% of the jurisdictions are using some system that uses a paper-based and has some paper record which you go back and audit. And this is just sort of highlighting the amount of registrations and the confirmation notices that were sent as we entered a phase to try to make sure the rolls were accurate prior to Election Day. And with that, I think the big takeaway before I turn it over to Vice Chair Hicks, it was just a significant turnout that we had, and that folks decided to use all modes of voting. And what that tells me for the election officials is that when you are entering an election cycle, election officials have to be prepared for a lot of different forms of voting. They are sort of separate elections. They have different preparation, calendars, and timelines. And so if you're an election official, you're going to be preparing for voters that are going to vote by mail. Some are going to vote early, and then some are going to be voting on Election Day. And that really is, a lift for a lot of election officials. That's why we're very thankful for them and for the data that they provided to the Congress. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Vice Chair Hicks.
Thank you, Chairman Palmer. So, one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and three things. One, the general election overall, but first I wanted to say thank you to AEI for having me here. And I look forward to being on the podcast again someday soon. The other piece of that is that the EVE survey, I always view as the census for voting. Basically, all the information that you can possibly need or want, you can find in that survey. And like Chairman Palmer, I want to thank the men and women of the EAC and the states who sent that information in, because this is a heavy lift for them to do. Like Chairman Palmer mentioned, 3 in 10 states conducted voting by mail in 2024. And what's that mean in terms of there was a decrease because of COVID overall? 18 states required some sort of excuse to vote by mail, and 38 states did not. And looking by the faces in the room, 18 and 38 do not add up to 50. It adds up to 56. So that's the 50 states, 5 territories, and the District of Columbia. 12 states conducted all mail voting. 9 states did so statewide, and 3 did so by jurisdiction. And if you look at this slide, 66%, almost 67% conducted mail-in voting, a decrease of 26% over the 90 million mail ballots that were transmitted in 2020. Almost 48% or 72% of those ballots that were sent out by vote by mail were returned. And of those that were returned, almost 600,000 were reported as rejected, meaning that almost 99.9% of those were counted. And I'll talk about a little bit of why those were rejected on the next slide. But nearly 15 million were reported to be returned by drop boxes. And among those states that had drop boxes available in both the 2020 and 2024 election, the percentage of those returned increased by nearly 10% over those 2 election cycles. So what were the reasons that people with the mail ballots were rejected? Nearly over 40% of those were rejected because of some sort of non-matching or incomplete signature, which is by far the biggest reason why. 18% of those were rejected, were not listed by EVE survey, such as all signature issues, neither returned undeliverable or returned by the voter, multiple issues with a single mail ballot, and the rejection reason not being specific. Additionally, common reasons for rejecting those ballots received were basically not receiving it by the deadline, and another cast ballot was also accepted, meaning that things being put in place to prevent double voting. And the ballot lacking a voter signature, or the ballot envelope lacking a voter signature being at 10%. Together, those top 5 reasons accounted for more than 80% of the reasons why those ballots were rejected, and wanted to praise those states that allowed for ballot curing, which means returning ballots that were rejected containing an error, meaning that the voter were allowed to correct the ballot and then have that actually cast. So 76% of states allowed for some sort of ballot curing on or before Election Day. Among those states that allowed ballot curing, 1.5 of the ballots entered the ballot curing process and allowed for that to be done successfully. The most common reports of those being changed, as I said earlier, were missing voter signatures, non-matching voting signatures, and incomplete documentation. 30% of the states allowed for ballot curing ahead of the deadline and to be counted for the 2024 election. The only state that did not allow for this deadline that fell before Election Day was Louisiana. The latest were deadlines in December of 2024, and that was Puerto Rico and California. And lastly, what I'll talk about is audits. This chart shows the most common auditing activities conducted by states before and after Election Day. And auditing allows for the public to get a more sense of confidence that the election occurred accurately. So nearly all the states, 92%, reported some sort of logic and accuracy testing and voting systems accounting for that. And 66% allowed for or reported conducting audits on a post-election audit tabulation, as you can see from that second line there. Of these states, the most indicated that they were statutorily required to do the audit, which is a slight decline from 2022, which had a peak in 2022 of 92.9%. Missouri, Nebraska, Utah reported that they conducted an audit that required a formal administration rule or guidance, and in Guam and Louisiana, post-election tabulation audits were optional under the law. So with that, I will turn this over to Charles, I believe, is next. And thank you all for having me here.
Great. There we go. I will echo my other panelists in thanking John for for chairing today, and thanking AEI for keeping data geeks like me and y'all presumably in the game in terms of trying to figure out what makes elections run. Before I get going, I have a point of personal privilege, which is also to thank AEI for this building. And the reason it's personal privilege is that if you look this building up online, you will see that it was originally called the McCormick Apartments. Andrew Mellon was the most famous resident of these apartments, but the building was attributed to Stanley Dexter McCormick, or rather Stanley McCormick. In fact, when the building was built in 1917, Stanley had been declared mentally incompetent 10 years before. And in fact, the building was paid for, overseen by his wife, Catherine Dexter McCormick. Now, I mention Catherine Dexter McCormick because for 23 years, I lived in McCormick Hall as a housemaster for 23 years in Stanley McCormick Hall at MIT, which was not built by Stanley McCormick, was actually donated by Catherine Dexter McCormick. So I've lived my life going from building to building, named after or attributed to Stanley McCormick, but in fact was there because of Catherine Dexter McCormick. And so I'm also thankful for KDM, as we call her at MIT. So let me hop back into this election. And the question that, in general, that I like to put out was that if I claim, as I do, that this was a well-run, well-appreciated election, how would we know? And one of the ways in which we know is there's a lot of data out there to confirm that it was a well-run election. And also a lot of data out there to confirm that there are a million moving parts to this election that have to mesh together to make it well-run. And so I'm going to frame my remarks in terms of 3 data sets and 3 points, just to kind of dip a little bit into the data that we have to reflect back on this election. And I hope in the Q&A and the discussion that we can delve more in the actual evidence from this election. So the 3 data sets are the EVES that we're talking about, that's brought us together today, the voting and registration supplement of the current population survey, and the other one, how we voted. I'm glad some of you all got that connection. How the survey of the performance of American elections in 2024, and each of these,
Which Charles?
which by the way, I'm responsible for. So and I'll come back to that in just a second. And the 3 data sets I will eventually peg to 3 issues, just to kind of as starters. So the 3 data sets are, of course, the EVES, and we've gotten an introduction to the EVES already. As Commissioner Hicks mentioned, this really is a census, administrative census of elections in the United States, comprehensive census of over 6,400 jurisdictions, 536 different measurables for every jurisdiction. So you do the math. That's a lot of data in this survey, which covers election administration from voter registration to election technology and a wide variety of topics in the middle. We have the current population survey, the voter and registration supplement, which is a national representative sample of 50,000 eligible voters in the United States. It's part of every other November, the current population survey's labor force survey. And they add on a few questions about the last election. They ask eligible voters, were they registered? If they registered, did they vote? If they voted, what mode did they use to vote in? And if they didn't vote or if they weren't registered, why not? Okay, so that's it. It's very simple, but it's very powerful. We'll come back to this. And then finally, the Survey of the Performance of American Elections, SPAE, is a sample also of, in this case, of registered voters that I've been able to put into the field after every presidential election since 2008 and most midterms since 2008. We have 200 respondents from every state, and so we have over 10,000 respondents. We focus on the experience of the voter, asking about what happened for those who voted in person, their experience when they voted in person, for those who voted by mail, their experience when they voted by mail. We also ask about attitudes, about things about fraud and about reform and other features of the election. So as I said, 3 data sets, 3 points I want to very quickly make and illustrate. First of all, with the EVES, kind of following up on some words that Commissioner Hicks said, something about absentee ballot rejections. And then using the current population survey to talk a bit about voting mode usage, continuing on some words that Commissioner Palmer said, and then on voter confidence, some data from the SPAE survey. So with respect to vote mode usage, again, as we know, there was a decline in the use of voting by mail in 2024 compared to 2020. The thing that CPS helps to draw our attention to, because they've been asking the same question since 1996, and actually the survey goes back to 1964, but the same question since 1996. There has been a steady decline in voting on election day over the past 2 decades. And actually, if you were to take the trend lines of voting on election day, voting early in person, voting by mail across this entire time, stop in 2016, and then just extend those lines out to 2024, we're about where we would have been without COVID. A little different, a little more actually voting early in person than when we would have had, but we're kind of back on trend. So that's an important thing to note. The other thing about the CPS, because there are so many observations, is that we can look at the fraction of voters who vote using each mode in each of the states. Now, these triangular plots, I first encountered one of these plots when I took chemistry and geology in high school. Sometimes these are known as snow globe plots for reasons I won't get into today because we're not animated. But the point is that look at the middle triangle, the triangle right in the middle of the graph. If a state is at the very top, that's 2016. Everybody in that state is voting on election day. If it's the bottom left, everybody in that state is voting by mail. Bottom right, everybody in that state is voting early in person. In 2016, most states, there's like a dozen way at the top. These are the old school, old guy states. I was in one, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, many southern states. Everybody votes on election day. Down the left leg were the states that were beginning to experiment with all voting by mail, like California, Washington, Oregon. And then the other side were other states that were beginning to open up and really liberalize voting early in person, like Texas, like North Carolina. Okay, so we see 2016, and then we see, oh, by the way, in the middle, in that gray triangle, right in the middle, it's not the Bermuda Triangle, but it's the Florida Triangle. The state right in the middle was Florida, which means in 2016, it was doing three different types of voting in roughly equal proportion. So the thing I would draw your attention to, in 2016, most states had one major form of voting and a secondary form of voting. It was usually, the major form was usually voting on election day, and then convenience either by mail or early. We had 2020, and then 24. That's the right-hand side triangle. First thing I'll note is that the Florida Triangle now has a bunch of states. And what this means is that a large number of states are now basically running 3 elections. And that's important when we think about the hard job that state and local officials have to do, because each of these modes interacts with each other. If you come in to vote on election day, and if I'm Florida, I need to make sure you haven't voted early. I need to make sure you haven't voted by mail. And similarly, okay? So there's a lot more states doing that. Many fewer states are the old guy states. In fact, really only New Hampshire and Alabama are up at the very top. And every other state really has multiple modes of voting now, unlike before. Okay, absentee ballot rejections. The point here, the neat thing about the data in EVES, and again, there's hundreds of thousands of data points in EVES, is that we can really dig down into particular administrative practices in the states and the localities. And so these bar charts show for 2016, 2020, and 2024. The light blue is the number of mail votes. The dark blue is total votes, so you see the fraction that was mail votes. You can see a little thin line there, red line. Those are the ballots that were sent in by mail that were rejected. Okay, so really thin. It's about 1% of votes, really, really thin. Okay, but we can also look at the counties. Okay, so those of you who like scatter plots, which I do. The y-axis is for every county, the percentage of mail ballots that were rejected when they were returned. And that was in 24, and then 2020, the x-axis is 2020. We see a number of things here. The thing I would focus on is, first of all, there's a big cluster around 1% on both sides. There's high correlations between the 2 years, suggesting that, that administrative practices are persistent across election to election. So something that might have led one county to have a, say, large number of rejections. For instance, it turns out that in a lot of counties with a lot of college students, they'll have higher rejections because young people these days can't sign their name consistently, okay? So there'll be that sort of persistence at the local level. And then finally, in talking about voter confidence, survey the performance of American elections, we ask a series of questions that have become the gold standard in the study of voter confidence in public opinion. And this is the timeline of the percentage of voters, or rather registered voters in the surveys, who report being confident, either somewhat confident or very confident, that their vote was counted as intended, that votes in their county were counted as intended in the state and nationwide. So at the top is your vote. You'll see that people are typically more confident about their vote, less confident about the county, less so about the state, at least so about the nation. There's a lot. In fact, I have a whole hour presentation about this. I'm not going to give it to you, but the thing to note here is that by this metric, confidence levels in this election are the highest we have ever measured. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that, complicated reasons for that, but the important thing is that the sag of confidence that we saw in 2020 has rebounded in 24. And we can also drill down into the states because we have a good number of observations, an equal number of observations in every state. So in these three Hicks maps, we show the average for all the states in the District of Columbia, the percentage who stated that they were confident or very confident about elections in their state. And we can see, like in 2016, there's a range from white, the least confident, to dark green. That's supposed to be dark gold. It doesn't look gold to me. Those were the most confident in 2016. In 2020, we see voters in the white states. That's where the sagging happened the most. You will recognize many of those states. Those are battleground states, generally Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Nevada. And then 2024, we see most states dark green again, with a few states, few states not quite that dark green. A few of them are battleground states, but the interesting thing is that in 2024, the states that were the lowest in confidence, and by the way, even those states were not particularly low in confidence, were of two sorts. One, states with a lot of mail ballots. That's become a new factor as voters consider whether they're confident about elections in their state, and how close the election was in 2024. So, 3 data sets, 3 points. Here it is, and I'm happy to give it back over to our moderator.
All right, and I am going to have one slide. 3 slides, three surveys, I have one slide. And really, this is a slide that actually has been seen twice before in some ways in the earlier presentations. And I will talk about it substantively, but it is the breakdown of election day, early voting, and absentee voting at a national level for presidential races only, and using the EVE survey. And just, I want to remind you that the EVE survey came out yesterday, and so we are digesting it, and I'm going to give two props here. One is, I'm going to steal a joke here, one big, beautiful survey. This is a big, substantive survey with a lot of data, but also a lot of analysis, and I have reasons to think very highly of it. So let me put the other thing up here. I wrote a book a very long time ago. It is now 20 years old, called Absentee and Early Voting: Trends, Promises, and Perils. And one of the timing of it was that this was being written after the very first EVE survey had come out. And you recall, of course, we had the 2000 election, we had the Help America Vote Act being passed a couple years later, the Election Assistance Commission being created, and this survey coming out for the first time. And in some ways, it was a treasure trove of information that we hadn't had before, because again, Charles's other 2 surveys are extremely valuable. Those are surveys of voters, and that gives a perspective, but this is asking of the jurisdictions themselves, the states and localities, how much of this did you do? What did you do? And on also some surveys of laws and what they have, laws and procedures, what they have in place. Now, the original survey was a lot smaller, and I will say, it is hard to imagine a more difficult survey to conduct because, as everyone knows, elections are very decentralized, and that means the states do very different things, or even when they do similar things, they often call things by different names, and getting reporting from all of these jurisdictions and getting the reporting that's relatively consistent is difficult. My one example, negative example, which I remember from the very first survey was the state of Maine had a big 0 when it asked, how much voting by mail did you have? And 0. And so I called them, and they said, and of course elections are decentralized in all sorts of ways, they said, well, if you really want that number, you're going to have to call all of the 462 towns in Maine and get each of their numbers and add them up so that you can get the answer. This survey obviously has expanded in terms of the things that are asked, but also improved the way in which we think about things. It's not perfect. States still have different conceptions of what they're doing, and it doesn't always fit into the boxes. States don't always report 100%, but we've come a very long way. And just one other selling point for the survey. It's great for us who wants to dig into the data, great for the general public, but I think it's really important for Congress and the federal government to really be able to have a window into the world of voting. Here, Congress has, and it doesn't always act. It's hard to get both sides to agree on big legislation, but we have our moments, we do, and we talk about issues. And for those moments, really understanding what's going on out in the states, the different practices and procedures and what is developing and what needs to be regulated or not, is something that this survey provides that really wasn't there before. So if nothing else, I think this survey really is a great window for Washington to look out to the states and say, I really have a better handle on what's happening. So let me go to this one slide and just emphasize a couple of things, and then I'm going to talk about a few things that play off of that as well. In the book, the broad thesis was, boy, we've started to do some voting by mail and some early voting, and the trend is up, and of course we can see that has continued. One interesting point, of course, we can talk about the COVID year where we had after a steady uptick in voting by mail, we had a very large uptick in 2020, and then we had a little bit of a coming down again to maybe what the trend would have been before in 2020 if we hadn't had 2020. But we also see early voting, and I think if you go there, if you look at some earlier trends on this, early voting had always been lower than voting by mail, but the trend was it was slightly catching up and slowly catching up. And by these numbers, and I think there still is a little bit of fuzziness sometimes between what is early and mail voting, and we could argue about it. But by these numbers and by the survey numbers as well, voting in person early is a slightly larger phenomenon now than voting by mail. So that's it's interesting. And we've, of course, voting on election day has come significantly down. So we're not quite at a third, but we're pretty close. And I guess, if trends are to continue, one would expect that these 3 modes of voting, the upswing is still with early voting and mail voting, but I know just a slightly stronger trend to early voting. I do not have charts like Charles does, those triangle. I couldn't do them, but I like to call them, if anybody remembers the alternative version of dominoes called triominoes. I like to call them the triominoes chart. You ever know triominoes? Anyway, the triangular chart. But I think the point I want to illustrate is similar to what Charles shows in those charts. In my book, early book, I try to figure out, so we have these national numbers, but the states all look very different, right? The states are sometimes in very traditional places. Sometimes the states are very heavily vote by mail. And so I, in the book, had created a few categories and just want to think about them today. I think our states are falling into categories. One I will note is the states that have high early voting and not very much mail voting at all, really. And those core states, I think, are Arkansas, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, and Tennessee. And I will note Texas and Tennessee were some of the originators of early voting, at least on scale, back in the 1990s. They were the first ones to really do it. And even some of these states don't really make it hard to vote by mail. You have no excuse absentee voting, for example, in Georgia, and you still have only 5% or so of people voting by mail, but you have over 60% voting, and sometimes over 70% in those core states. There are a couple other states I might put in that category, but that is a type of voting that is out there. It's not voting everywhere, but there's a core of states that vote like that. Of course, there are also states that vote heavily by mail, and we've seen them for a while, but some new entrants have come into them, and the numbers have broadly gone up. If we remember, Washington or Oregon first moved essentially to 100% voting by mail, close to it, and essentially 100%, I will say, and Washington State was behind it. Colorado had sort of changed over the years, but also was very high. I used to have states like Hawaii as well. So Utah. So you have a number of states that have moved to very, very high percentages now, often over 70%. In case of California, over 80%, and Colorado and Utah, Hawaii, Washington, Oregon are all well over 90%. So states that are just very, very, very strongly. Arizona, as I mentioned, is 75. So anyway, states that are primarily voting by mail states. And then, Charles mentioned the traditional states. I guess I would throw Mississippi in his little list of New Hampshire and Alabama, Mississippi as the highest, but still doing over 80% of voting on election day. But also states like Oklahoma and Pennsylvania, more in the 70s, and Kentucky, Missouri, South Dakota, in the 60% or more people voting on election day, and a bunch of other little states still over 50%. All those declining, but still quite a number of places that do a lot of election day voting. I too had a category which was mixed, and Florida was heavy on that, and Nevada sort of half fit in that way back in the day. It is a broader category, but it's a little bit. I think some of those are moving in and out of that category. We can talk about that later, but these are categories of states that look very different than those national numbers, which look like close to a third. Now we have very different types of voting and different infrastructures of voting in different states. So I went back and I looked at my rough categorization in the book in 2004, and states often fit into these categories, but what we would think of high and low versions of voting by mail and voting in person have changed pretty dramatically. So if I looked at my 2004 categories, I had 25 out of the 51, including DC jurisdictions, had very low non-election day. Like basically they were, So we had very low numbers of states that had roughly half the states had election day voting was extremely high, and there were 11 states, moving on to this sort of 11 states with absentee with little early voting, and one high state was Oregon was 100%, Washington State was only 69%. Arizona was considered a very high voting by mail state at 41%, California at 31%. So even the numbers, except for those couple states, we were considering, state with California at 31% as an incredible voting by mail state. And today it's, well over 80%, and there are plenty of states in that way. The high early voting states were almost the same. The Texas, Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas, and maybe West Virginia at the time. But these states were, getting 30% or 40% of people voting early, and today they are getting, 60 or 70% as well. So, just the categories have changed. The numbers of states that used to do just voting, very little voting, both have declined. But you see states like, interestingly, I think states like Massachusetts, old school, and New York, as states that were very, very traditional, doing very little voting by mail or early voting. And now they've kind of inched up. They're at 30%, 35%. And so I think those are the states that are kind of in the middle, but they're probably moving the other direction, but we've had some transformations as well. I'm going to say one more thing about one aspect of the report, and that is ballot curing. And here we have really the first time that the survey has taken on ballot curing. And I think this is something, just to put a simple definition for those in the room who might not be as familiar with it, especially in vote by mail states, when a ballot comes in that doesn't meet the requirements to be counted. It's often to deal with either a signature that doesn't match or a signature that isn't there, but it could perhaps be a registration problem or some other things that have to be dealt with, and the voter could possibly cure or fix that problem so that we could open that ballot up and count it. Now, there has been curing for a while, but the survey shows, interestingly, how many states are doing it and doing it in a more formal way, and what the processes are. And we do have some controversy here. I think we both have the ability to go out to voters more than we used to. It used to be, well, it's nice to be able to contact a voter, but how are you going to do that? Do you have an email address? Probably not. Maybe today you're more likely to have that. Going to get it to them by mail. Maybe there are even phone calls in some states. So there's more ability to do that. And then there is also the possibility of maybe that ballot can be cured even after Election Day or by a certain number of days. And I think that's where we're starting to see some of the controversies, disagreement about when ballots should be in, and if they're in by Election Day or if they have some extra time. And then if one thinks about the curing period, well, maybe you give voters even more time in addition to those 7 days that get in. Maybe you have another 7. And so there's some people who think that's a good thing, to make sure that every voter can fix that ballot to the last minute, and some people think it should be resolved more quickly. I guess I would also point to the issue of groups, that outside groups now potentially getting involved in sort of semi-recount-like situations. They know the list of people who their ballots will be thrown out and are not cured, and now they could go out to them and say, you should really get your ballot in, and that again can be a good thing, people encouraging everybody to get their ballots in, or maybe you'd think it's something of a pressure situation after the election is already completed and maybe should be limited in time. So I think just this is initial data, but that 1.5% of mail ballots entered the curing process, and a good number of them came out. And secondly, I think just to highlight again how important this question of signatures is, especially signature match, but also missing signatures. But signature match has become a real issue for a number of states where they have lots and lots of people voting by mail. They have a signature on file. The states that do a lot of mail are usually pretty serious about the checks. Sometimes they use technology as well as humans. But they're getting a substantial number of non-matches that then either have to be cured or end up not being counted. And so I think the curing data is sort of the great new early beginning to data that this survey shows the value of it, that this is a new or developing procedure in elections that now we have some information on that we can begin. So I will end there, and we have some time to discuss a little ourselves, and then we're going to warn you if you want a question, we'll have a mic to come around and you can formulate your questions while we're quickly talking. Maybe I could start with Charles. If you want, you highlighted 3 different types of surveys, but maybe just a little bit about the different ways in which surveys of individuals versus this information coming from election officials, some of the pros and cons, but how they complement each other as well.
Yeah, so thanks, John. That's a really good question. Well, there's actually a continuum here. So there are some things that the surveys of voters can get that we will never get from Eves and that are important for public policy. The most obvious are those that tie even administrative behavior to attitudes that people might have. And the government, rightfully so, is never going to do a survey that asks people how they voted or other attitudes. And I think everybody in this room understands that election, or should, that voting policy is part of public policy, and that people rightfully have a diversity of opinions about that. And so it's going to be the surveys done by, say, academic surveys that could get to issues of attitudes about other things. So that's one end. Certainly the Census Bureau surveys are not going to ask people how they voted either, right? So what can say the Census Bureau survey tell us that like Eves can't, or where do those divide? The first thing I would say is that, as I mentioned before, the Census Bureau survey only asks about 6 or 7 questions, okay, just about behavior basically on election day. The SPAE is more involved, but still it only asked about 40 questions. As I mentioned, the Eves has, I just did the math, 4 million data points. Okay, so just a granularity at the county level that really neither survey can get to. The other thing that I'll mention, this is a little bit of a cautionary tale in using Eves. For those of us who are interested in voting mode use, and John was just talking about this, which is to say that it's really great that I'll put it this way, it's really great that more and more counties and states are reading the instructions, and that there's more follow-up now. But it's still the case, and I actually haven't looked for 2024, where some states will insist, for instance, that they don't have early in-person voting, they only have absentee voting, when in fact they have places they open up and advertise to their voters, come and vote early in person at the clerk's office. And that that is early in-person voting by the instructions in the Eves, but under the state law is not recognized as such. And although you can figure out who came to the clerk versus who mailed it in, the state, for whatever reason, insists on not reporting that breakdown. And so by combining the CPS data with the Eves data, you can kind of triangulate into the couple of states left where they're not quite following the instructions. And one can make a decision about what to do about those counties. In many cases, I, as a researcher, will go back and answer the way I think they should have answered. So that's one of the ways. But I would just really double down on the point that the Eves data, when you're coming to administrative data, is the best thing that we have. The CPS and the SPAE data approach voting from the perspective of the voters. And I think that as we're trying to get an assessment of how the election unfolded, having both the administrative side and then what the voters experienced, helps us to get a complete view of what happened.
I will just echo Charles's point and maybe make Don Palmer squirm a little bit, because we, and in Virginia, where Don ran elections, and it wasn't, he didn't make the decision on what to call it, that was the legislature's decision, but we had for a long time, and some states still have in-person early absentee voting. And a number of times in Virginia, I would show up at what looked like an early voting site, a gym, which had foliage, and I would show up at the desk, and they would check me in, but what they really were doing was filling out an absentee ballot application for me and checking with the database that I hadn't voted already. And then they said, great, you're good. Go over to that DRE machine with no paper, and cast a ballot. And at the end of the day, then they gave me a sticker as I walked out that said, I voted absentee. So just the terminology it can often be different. But there has been great improvement. I will note that one of the states, when it looks at the top line, 50, it adds up to, these categories add up to 150%. You're like, and having the ability to go back to the surveys of voters to figure out what they did, it was pretty obvious what they did. They combined They double counted a couple things, but you know, the changes over time. We shouldn't expect that everybody is going to adopt all the same terminology or always fill this out perfectly. But I think the process of having done it for all these years and having some respect on both sides as to what to do, and I will add, just not to compliment both of you too much, and to all of the people who work on this at the EAC, but also just a review process that's much more thorough. I know some very early pre these commissioners surveys didn't always quite have a good eye check of some of these things, which is what we can spot. Let me ask Tom, and I mentioned in my presentation I thought that the survey was particularly valuable for Congress, again, because when these debates do come up, people really need to know what's really happening. And you spent a lot of time in the post-Hava days in the Congress, and maybe your thoughts on how this data and this survey is useful to Congress.
Thank you for that question. I think of it as there's a way to look at the survey and then propose to members of Congress legislation in terms of these are the trends that we are seeing, these are the things that we are looking at. Maybe we can add some money to this to help states with the administration of elections. And I think that came about particularly more so in 2009 with the MOVE Act. As well, but I think that the survey was used in when it was published in June of 2009 to formulate some of that legislation. But I do think that there are ways that groups have used the survey to formulate ways of getting states to improve the process. A former commissioner would describe this as groups would sue using this survey, but I think of it as it's valuable to improve the process overall. So from those early days of when we were talking earlier before we got up on stage about how the survey was basically 25, 26 pages to where it is now of killing trees, I think of it as it's evolved, and I think that we are looking to continually evolve that by having an off-year survey, possibly, to continue that trend. So states can use that, and members of Congress can use that to improve the process overall. Because working in the House, every member thinks that they are a election expert, and so to see these sorts of things play out, of hey, this is how the information that's being used for early voting, and so you should campaign this way, or in-person voting and so forth. So I do think that it's really valuable for members to get this, and we are looking to go back to the trend of putting this tangibly in each member's office hands. So.
Yeah, and I might add, just we've had a long conversation, 20-plus year conversation, it's still going on, but about having paper be an important part of the election process, whether it's paper purely or a machine that has a paper backup, or at least that there be some paper record. And the survey is very helpful in sort of being able to detail those trends, which broadly are that we have moved strongly away from machines that don't have any paper. And again, we have some debates about exactly how we count and when we count and how we use the paper, but the long trend of how we've changed in that is documented very well in the survey, as people have reported. So Don Palmer, maybe I could take you back to your days as an election administrator, both Virginia and Florida, and think about how the survey data is useful to you, but also maybe from a perspective of someone who's actually going to have to be involved in filling that out and trying to get the right information that feeds this survey. What can you tell us about your time in two different eras as to along with this survey?
Well, I think that at the state level, you really do, it's more of a managing the process to make sure you get the data from all the jurisdictions. And that can be a very difficult process. at the state level, but you really recognize that a lot of the data is coming from the locality themselves. After a federal election that could have been very busy, and this is the last thing they want to be doing in December, January. And so it's been a lift. It's made me reflect on what are ways that we can make this easier for them, for the localities and for the states to provide that data. And I think that for me, and I think we want to be able to show this to the Congress as well, is that when you can look at each localities and their performance. And look, it's at a state level, you're managing a process, and we all want to end from A to B. We want to make sure we get through this together, complying with the laws, state and federal. So the EAVS data is very valuable in seeing, how are all your counties performing? Are there issues in certain counties? The last thing I would say is that, when I was just coming into the state of Florida as their director, there had been some challenges with EAVS collection in a lot of states. And there was, I think it was a $10 million grant. We did not win that grant. There were 5 states that received about $2 million each. The quality of data was dramatically improved because they improved the statewide registration system that allowed a lot more of that data to be easily collected and much more accurate. And so there was just a lot of benefit out of investing in the collection of this data. And we haven't had an investment like that since, but I think you see as our technology improves, as our databases are upgraded, you're going to get better data. And that was always something at the state level we wanted to make sure is that we didn't have to collect a lot of this ourselves, that the systems itself would provide that data. And so that's sort of my experience, but we're very grateful to the localities because in the end, they're doing the majority of the work.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to emphasize that some of the data you see is reported at the state, but each state is decentralized in its own way, has localities that look different, whether it's small towns in Massachusetts or large counties or a mix of things, and states are sometimes more top down or bottom up, and so there's a different process, and I mean both the automation but also the cooperation with, you think of the difficulty of finding 50 or 56 if you include the territories and DC jurisdictions, but really you're talking about the data surfacing from the many thousands,
But the one thing I do appreciate is getting a phone call from the EAC and say, all right, Don, are you sure this is your final answer? Yeah. And then they would point out errors, and we'd go back to the drawing board and say, what's going on here? Why, is this correct? Are we sure? Before we swore to it. But we appreciated the EAC reaching out to us because it could help translate. It could help us say, look, I'm a third party looking at this. Mm-hmm. There seems to be an error here. You need to really look at it again. And so we're very thankful. I mean, I was thankful at the state level. Now at the EAC, we hope to provide that services to states and localities.
Great. So I'm going to do I'm going to count myself as having answered this question, but I'm going to do a quick lightning round for each of you. Just one thing in the EAVS survey that you want to highlight, either something new that they're doing, something interesting. Don't need we don't need to hear the whole explanation. Maybe it'll just tease people to go look in the report and get this heavy report and look at it. But one thing that
you want me to start?
Yeah, why don't you start? We'll go down the line.
Let's put up the first slide. If we have it.
Yeah. See,
well,
now we're going to test our technical capabilities.
That's okay. We got this here. The big number here is, we didn't talk about it, 770,000 Americans served as poll workers across the country, and they really are the backbone of elections. And one of the things related to this that we asked election officials is how difficult or easy it is to recruit poll workers. And it's been a challenge. COVID was a major challenge. The generation that is serving 61 to 70 years of age, they are retiring and moving on. The issue is at least half of our jurisdictions are still finding it difficult to recruit poll workers. And so that next generation is going to have to show up. It really is Gen X's and the newer generations. So that's the one thing I wanted to point out was just it wouldn't happen without those 770,000 people.
I will note that Charles probably knows the answer to this, but there's this rumor that the average poll worker is 71 years old. And, that The numbers on age kind of went down significantly during COVID 2020, arguably more need, maybe more availability of these people, and then it sort of bounced back up to an older crowd in 2024. So that's one addendum to Don's point. But Charles.
So I'd say two things. One is a set of questions that we've only glancingly referred to is, I guess it's section B, the UOCAVA section, which is the overseas civilians and uniformed voters section. And there's a lot of interesting information in there. One of the things that I always find interesting is that usually this is referred to military voting, but increasingly using that section, we can see that that section is growing in terms of the civilian overseas population relative to military, and I think that probably has important policy implications in thinking about UOCAVA as a category of voting.
Yeah, and just I will note, and I know Don and I had a conversation about this just this morning. One thing to remember about this report, of course, it is large, but it grew out of several things. Yes, the EASE survey, but there were other things that Congress really asked the EAC, or prior to the EAC, someone else, but to find out information about registration and UOCAVA. And now we've kind of been able to incorporate all of that into one large survey that has consistent information. So that's another challenge that was there. There were lots of things that Congress wanted in different pieces, and now we've kind of assembled it as one. Tom.
Well, I would go back to the ballot curing to ensure that folks, if they make an error, that they're not going to be disenfranchised, to ensure that they are able to still cast their vote, and to see how states are using that process. And like I said earlier, over 75% of states allow for some sort of ballot curing, so that is allowing for the system to still adhere to ensuring that it's safe and secure, but also to allow for folks not to be disenfranchised. And to see that in tangible numbers, I think is really good. The other piece that I would talk about is the fact that we've used this to look at the number of poll workers that we have, and then to dictate policy. So for instance, now on August 12th, we're going to have a National Poll Worker Recruitment Day, which we've had in the past, based on the numbers of how do we recruit new poll workers. And that's, I think, a reflection of the survey overall.
Great. So now is the time where the people can speak to the government and Charles and I, but we invite you to ask questions. And there are mics coming around, so if you have a question, please identify yourself and make it a question.
That's what I always say.
All right, I am seeing a quiet crowd here. So here we go, right here.
Hi, thank you. That was super insightful. I've got a question mainly about election fraud. So we see in the cases of, like freak incidents, like the burning of ballot boxes or postal workers not delivering ballots. So what is the standard procedure when that is uncovered? And is there anything being done to stop that happening in the future proactively?
Well, I would say that the Department of Justice is law enforcement. Election officials, we administer the election. If we see, obviously, we don't want to be the victim of vote fraud or vote crimes. But the Department of Justice and the FBI, they're going to investigate and then prosecute. We're there to assist if they need information. And we try to be proactive on just securing the process. So, for example, you use the bombing of the ballot box. There are procedures to try to defend against that and to be prepared for that sort of thing. And so it's a whole all of government sort of approach, both at the local level, right on the ground, and then obviously if it's a federal election, it's going to involve the FBI and the Department of Justice.
I would expand a little bit on that to say that the United States Postal Inspection Service, which is the oldest law enforcement body in the United States, looks at the mail piece of that and has an internal way of, with their Inspector General, to look at where things may have gone awry and and try to correct those sorts of things. But I also want to say that that's a very small percentage of the percentage of ballots that are called into question, as opposed to, if we look at the survey, basically 156 million people casting ballots. But if you only have 1,000, so that's not even 0.0001% sort of thing. So all those ballots are important, but to make sure that we keep those into perspective of, yes, if there's an issue that arises, that we correct that, and how do we correct that so that it doesn't occur again, but also to take into effect that that means that over 99% of ballots were received and counted accurately.
And just quickly to add to Don's point, of course, because we're so decentralized, there's similar processes at the state level too for law enforcement. And,
There is, absolutely.
as well. So in fact, many of those cases would go there. All right, we're looking for another. We could do like we sometimes do in the classroom. We could call on
Cold
people,
call.
right? Cold call people. Right here. Sorry, I didn't see the hand. Yes, please, right here.
Hi, I'm Josh with the Committee on House Administration. And on behalf of Chairman Stile, we really want to thank the EAC and all the hard work they put into the Eves report. As one of the main beneficiaries of it, this data is going to be priceless as we go forward. So we had a question specifically for Charles. You pointed out that the 7 swing states traditionally have the lowest rate of voter confidence. And I was wondering, is there a large factor that most of the survey pointed to as to why there was a lower confidence, or was the but-for cause that it's just a swing state, it's just going to be a close election?
Right, this is a good question, and I have another hour-long presentation on this one too. But the short version is this: if we look, just compare 2016, 2020, and 2024, and look at the responses to the question about trust in the state election. If we look at in 2016, in every state, it's something like the least trustful state had 80% of their respondents saying that they were confident about the votes, about elections in their state. If you divided that in terms of partisanship, D's and R's, in the bluer the state, so the more democratic the state, the more grumpy Republicans were. And in the redder the state, the more grumpy the Democrats were. So that was a fairly straightforward, story about, at the state, kind of the minority party being a little less trustful. Nonetheless, large majorities of the out parties in those states were still confident in elections in the state. So you can think about sort of a downstater in Republican in Illinois kind of thing. Chicago, blah, 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 blah. And so that was kind of 2016. In 2020, Republicans were less confident than Democrats in every state. And they were the least confident in those battleground states. And even more unconfident in battleground states with a lot of mail. And I think everybody in the room kind of understands the political dynamics of 2020 and how that might happen. In 2024, as we analyze what's happening in the states from this partisan perspective, and again, we really we have to talk about this in partisan terms. It looks like Democrats and Republicans are coming back together in different ways in the states. Democrats have attitudes about Democrats and how they think about their states. They're first of all a little less confident than Republicans overall, so they're kind of generalizing in terms of the national election onto their state. But beyond that, they seem to have gone back into this old pattern of being more distrustful in red states and more trustful in Democratic states. And not really moved by policy considerations or other things. When we look at the Republicans in the states, the Republicans are the least trustful in states that have a lot of mail, that still have slow vote counting, and have not pass legislation to do things like favor in-person voting versus voting by mail. Okay, so it looks like Republicans in the states are much more sensitive to policy choices that are being made by the state legislature, and are much more sensitive to things like counting speed than Democrats are in the states. So that's kind of what we're seeing. I have a PhD student who's doing a dissertation about this. Happy to talk more about it, but I think the bottom line is that it's certainly clear that when we look at the state level, that kind of national politics now is really informing confidence, and that D's and R's right now, it could change in 2 years or 4 years, but right now, D's and R's are kind of processing the world in very different ways, which was not true before 2020.
Can I follow up on one thing? Because I know just from earlier conversations, presentations, Charles, I mean, one interesting thing you found in 2020 especially was Republicans as the losing party in the election were a little less confident than the typical losing party. But Democrats as the winning party became super confident. It was the best, everything was the best run, really, confident. And also, of course, that divide happened across vote by mail. Republicans becoming much more negative about it, and Democrats thinking it really needed. Certainly on the voting patterns and some of the states, things have gone back a little bit to normal 2024, but what about those, so that's attitudes towards voting by mail, but what about those general attitudes towards how well the election is run? What do we think about those things partisan-wise today?
Yeah, and actually, thanks for reminding me about the Democratic trend, because back in 2020, and it extends to today a bit, that I was characterizing Democrats as being irrationally exuberant about the state of election administration. And I think that actually has consequences for policymaking in the states. So as John was saying, in 2020, everywhere, Democrats were confident everywhere that everything was great. And I think that had implications for how policy unfolded at the state level in Democratic states. We saw Democratic states, many of them doubling down, making permanent changes that were made in emergencies in 2020. Whereas in more Republican states, emergency procedures were allowed to basically revert back to pre-pandemic, which, by the way, to the press oftentimes was explained as being, kind of restricting access. But I think it's fair to say another interpretation was that, well, the emergency is over, and so we're not going to continue the emergency. But back to your point, Democrats said, "Oh yeah, no, we can't." And look at what was done in 2020. Local election officials, they could do this, they could do that, they could do everything. And so we can kind of, in some states, almost like pile, kind of progressive reform upon progressive reform in a couple of states, without thinking seriously through the administrative issues involved in doing many of these reforms. And so I think that there's kind of there's a downside to being too distrustful of elections. One should always be a little skeptical about all government, sure. But there are problems about being too distrustful. I think there's problems with being too trustful in many cases, because it underestimates the degree to which election officials can do a lot, but they're not magicians. And perhaps, it might be better to kind of curb a little bit of enthusiasm, and rather than add a new reform, make sure the old reforms are actually being administered well before one moves on. So a little editorializing there.
So curb your election enthusiasm. No. All right, what do we have out here? We have over here.
Yes, thank you. Rick LaRue, I'm a contributor at the Fulcrum, and I have a question related to turnout. And yes, it's gotten better. It's still at about 2/3 now. Are there indications from any of the jurisdictions where the turnout was higher, that there might be any commonality, any administrative contributions to that's in a nonpartisan way, that might, suggest, because fortunately I think the notion of improving turnout, which the old conventional wisdom used to help the Democrats, I think that may no longer be the conventional wisdom. At least I'm hopeful that's the case. But are there ways, that you've got any indications in the data that what you're collecting on the administrative side related to turnout can help increase it?
So I'll start with that. The one commonality in most states had some decline in turnout, but the states that increased in turnout, often by just a little bit, were the swing states. 6 of the 7 of them, I think, increased, and they were maybe only one state that was not a swing state increase. So clearly this battle was fought out with intensity in these states. Generally speaking, I mean, I think if you look at the long arc of voting, I like to joke that we are, or say, not joke, that we are in the golden age of voter turnout. In some ways we are. If you think even back to 2004, when the survey began, that we hadn't, in the modern era, since we let 18-year-olds vote, we hadn't had voter turnout over 60%, and all of our elections essentially been 60, or 2012 might have slightly dipped below, but they've been at 60. And then of course we had the extremely supercharged 2020 election, and then the last election was our second highest. So I mean, there was a dip back after COVID, after that level of intensity, but still we are at a pretty high level of turnout. And I think it is, we have all sorts of scholarship and debates about what election administration procedures help with turnout. There may be some. I think broadly speaking, people think of registration reforms can add to some turnout if one either has same day or some sort of automatic. And I think those terms are a little loaded, so I don't want to use them very specifically. But broadly, if you get a better list, a more comprehensive list, especially for those people who might be activated later, might have a 1 or 2% effect, which is great in terms of the statistical significance, and we're happy with that. But it's not, it's still probably not the main thing. The main thing is probably some sort of enthusiasm and maybe the polarization of the parties, which we don't like, is contributing to that. One thing I would add. And I think I've asked Charles this before, because Charles was, after the 2000 election, was very good at measuring what, if anyone, maybe some of you in this room remember 2000, where we had all sorts of questions about things like hanging chads or votes that were lost because they weren't quite recorded right. We had lots of people potentially, because of the technologies, being able to overvote, meaning vote twice for president, or you're allowed to undervote, like not vote for president, but often maybe one wondered, was the system set up that they sort of missed the race or it didn't record quite right? And Charles and with MIT and Caltech they sort of measured this, and that number actually went down after some of the reforms of 2004, where one has provisional voting and one has better technologies recording things. There's some registration issues that are also so again, I don't think these are the major drivers of turnout, but I do think there have been some aspects of administration which might have contributed to that.
Yeah, if I can piggyback on that. So the first quip I always make is that if you want a state with really high turnout, you want to be in a state that was settled by Scandinavian socialists about 100 years ago, right? Because it's the upper tier of states, right? It's the Dakotas, Minnesota, Montana. That's the place where you get the highest turnout, and it does have something to do with like long traditions of getting people out to vote. Thing number 2, the academic literature tells us, is, as John was saying, that campaigns push turnout, and with battleground states and all of that, that's the dynamic. And so then you get to the question of, can we discern statistically election administration changes that give rise to turnout changes? There's one big one. The Voting Rights Act, over a 30-year arc, has led to really large turnout increases in the South. And so now Georgia, for instance, is in the upper tier of states with respect to turnout. But in the short term, we usually find these 1 or 2% effects. So improving the voting machines, as John was just, even doing that, we had about 1.5 million more votes recorded in this election than when we would have had otherwise. Election day turnout, election day voting registration might increase turnout by a point. So all these things are really, really small. Some things might affect particular populations, and that's where like young people especially, where the turnout gap is the biggest, and that's where the research is ongoing right now.
All right, we have a question back here.
Thank you so much. My name is Karim Shaheen with Osgood Center of International Studies. I just had a question regarding the recent legal challenges that we've seen and concerns regarding how overseas ballots, especially those arriving after election day, and with like Arizona, those based on lineage-based residency for military families, and also the expansion of it, not just for overseas military ballots, but just overseas ballots in general. How ought we to navigate the tension between state discretion and federal guidance on these voting timelines? And what updates would you anticipate regarding the future standardization of these practices? Thank you.
So maybe I could turn to our former JAG lawyer and maybe overseas voter at one point, Don Palmer.
Well, what's interesting is that we're just going in cycles, it seems. I mean, if you play back the 2000 election, all of a sudden one of the big issues was the ballots that are coming in from overseas and the panhandle of Florida, and will it change the results? And there was all this litigation. And here we are, it's 2020, 2025, right? And we're still dealing, these issues are with us because it is difficult to be overseas and to use the mail system and ensure that your ballot's returned. Now, there have been the UOCAVA statute we mentioned before for uniform overseas citizens, and then the MOVE Act. These are reforms that the Congress implemented to try to streamline that and actually compress the timetable. But the bottom line is when you're overseas, you be in the military, a missionary, whatever your role is, unless there's procrastination involved, and ballots often come in right around the deadline or after the deadline. And so this is going to be a perennial issue until we find a way to either streamline the process or to look at those issues. But it's still with us today. I think we're doing better. I do think, in my view, but I lived overseas, so I know how difficult it can be. And unless if you do procrastinate, you're in danger your vote not counting. And so I think we're still dealing with this issue. Here we are in 2025, and it's still sort of an issue because this is a vulnerable population. I hate to call our military vulnerable, but again, most folks don't realize if you're waiting until the last minute, even the last 15 days, if you stick it in the mail, it may not be back in time.
I just wanted to add one other piece in that I also, when I was studying overseas in Europe, I had to vote absentee and vote using UCAVA. But I do think that there's a little bit of folks not realizing that, hey, I'm overseas, I'm still able to cast my vote as well. And so I think that there has been a push to ensure that those who are living overseas can still cast their votes and have those votes counted. I participated in an election this past weekend where folks overseas were not allowed to cast their vote. Because it was a snap election, basically. And so how do we ensure that those folks still have a say in the election process while ensuring that votes are counted, votes are received on time, and counted accurately?
So I'm going to wrap it up with one last down the line here, a question, and maybe it's a little unfair to our EAC commissioners, but we just had the report come out yesterday, the survey, and I want to think a little bit about the future, about things that you might be doing or might like to see doing. What kinds of things might we want to get at in this survey or maybe some other surveys? What areas of voting election administration might we want to get there? And again, for the EAC staff, these are the speculations of the commissioners, not a firm plan the day after, but beginning the conversation of what the next survey and others might look like.
I personally think that you want to look at what local election offices are doing, the personnel, the staffing, and the budgeting. And that helps us make decisions on, like, for example, recommendations to the Congress, how we develop our testing and certification program. Just on this slide here, 40%, now we're up to 40% of jurisdictions are using electronic poll books. So this is obviously something that is using the internet often, and we need to protect those systems, as the Congress has told us since 2017. And so, as you can see on the slide, we are sort of trying to respond to the needs of local election offices, and that's one example.
So I would say that of the 4 million data points that Charles had talked about earlier, what sort of things can we start to back or turn down so that we are not going to get a 10-inch binder for the survey moving forward? That's not 10 inches.
No, but it's pretty big.
But how do we also expand out to get more information to the chairman and others on issues? For instance, looking at demographics of who actually is running the elections. Can we get those sort of things into play so that we know that the average age of poll workers, but what's the average age of an election official? What are their demographics? What's their educational level? And so forth, you know, and how do we gear that towards making better policy?
So I will go contrary to type. Usually it's the academic who wants to pile on things I want the EAC to get. But I would actually go further than even dialing down. I think on the one hand, it may be, and I know the EAC is kind of thinking about the future of EVES, it might be time to think really about what the core is in EVES and focus on the quality of really the core items and making sure that the most policy relevant items are really bulletproof. And at the same time to think about, which I know the commission is doing, thinking about other important areas like the staffing, like budgeting, that's really important for policymakers and about which we know almost nothing. And there's some academic surveys going out there, but there's nothing like a really solid federal statistical instrument to get at really core features of other government organization. And so as an academic, I would encourage not only zero-based questioning, but maybe even negative-based questions. And if one were to use some of those savings for other questions, to kind of dig into the administrative apparatus to understand how different offices are organized. What's the relationship to local government in terms of authority, in terms of budgeting? What are the budgets? How many people do work for the office? What are the FTEs? There's a lot of questions out there. There's not 600 questions. There's probably a small number that could really be high leverage for doing better policy making at the federal and at the state level.
Great. Well, we'd like to thank Commissioners Hicks and Palmer and Charles Stewart for a wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you.